And here we are again, and this is part 2 of Berkeley, here at the lovely Portland Airport. Moving around here a little bit. Hopefully this won't be just the same old boring scenery. I'm sort of moving around here. You can get the nice, let's see if I can, there we go, nice scene out the window. Hopefully when we talk about Hume, I'll have a nice scenic backdrop for you. But now it's the same dull stuff, so we're talking about ideas and philosophy, and so last time we were talking about Berkeley, and thought we'd look a little bit at the two dialogues between Hylas and Philonous. Let's see, and so one thing to think about is, what is Berkeley's view? So one of his views is a kind of a metaphysical view, and that's idealism, that objects are simply collections of qualities or ideas, and to be is to be perceived. That is, to say something exists is saying some mind is having an experience or an idea. So, Berkeley will say, what is the idea of the chair? Well, a chair is simply a collection of the sensations, actual or possible, that we associate with the chair. And so, now as a metaphysical theory, most people see this as being sort of nutty. But some philosophers of language have said that Berkeley's stumbled on something profound, which is about the meaning of words in ordinary language. So he says that part of Berkeley's arguments for his view is this view that's called phenomenalism. And phenomenalism is a view that words in ordinary language refer to sense properties of objects, or their sense data. And so this is a view about what words mean and refer to. So, for example, take water. What does the word water mean? Well, Berkeley would say water, of course, means clear, colorless liquid that quenches thirst. Now, does it mean two atoms of hydrogen and one atom of oxygen in a covalent bond? No, not at all. It refers to the sense properties of water. And move away here to a little quieter area. So it refers to the sense properties of water. And so you can't sense two atoms of hydrogen and one atom of oxygen in a covalent bond, right? So that's the so-called chemical composition of water, but that's not what water means. And when a person from the less developed world who may not know the chemical composition of water use the word, he's referring to this clear, colorless liquid that quenches thirst. So now what Berkeley says is that when we use words, we say, when we're talking about an object, we don't mean object made of material substance. We mean and refer to a collection of experiences. So that's phenomenalism. This idea that words in ordinary language refer to sense properties, to sensation, a collection of actual and possible sensations. So the one way of describing Berkeley's view is that objects are permanent possibilities of sensation. So he goes from the phenomenalism view to the idealism view. So Berkeley argues because words refer, one of his many arguments, but he says, well, because words refer to these sense properties, that's all there is to the object. But some modern philosophers have said, well, this first part is right, this view on language, and let's hold on to that and get rid of the idealism. So that's one part of Berkeley that many philosophers like, this idea that the meaning of words in ordinary language has to do with sense data. One of the things that Berkeley brings up too is this question about empiricism, and you ask the question, you can ask the question, is empiricism a friend of science? And if you look at Locke's view, it seems like it is. And Locke actually was very influential in the early scientific revolution and laid the groundwork for a lot of what science did later on. Berkeley does optics, but most people think he's going the wrong way. But he's also even more of an empiricist than Locke. So he raises the question, do empiricism and science go together? And if you take empiricism really seriously, can you hold on to the concept of matter, of material substance? Okay, back in my seat here. Someone's shouting into their phone next to me. Again, phenomenalism is this view that words in ordinary language refer to their sense properties, and this looks like a view that makes sense for philosophy of language. And then on that basis, Berkeley argues that idealism is true. So many philosophers today will say, well, the idealism is wrong, but we kind of like the phenomenalism. That it's a view on philosophy of language that words do refer to these sense properties, and that the Aborigine and the scientist mean the same thing when they say they'd like a glass of water, or they would like a drink of water. I'm not sure if the Aborigine is going to use a glass or not. Maybe a gourd, but they both are referring to the same thing when they use the term for water. Okay. Now, what about where's Berkeley's proof for God? So that's sort of the God is kind of a centerpiece of Berkeley's view, and so you end up with this question. Well, okay, Berkeley says there's no proof for the concept of material substance, but where is Berkeley's proof for God? So here's what Berkeley says. He says, when I'm generating my own thoughts, I have my own thoughts and my ideas, and I'm conscious of coming up with what I can come up with all manner of ideas, and I just cook them up one after the other. So, but also I'm conscious of another will who gives me sensations. So he says I'm conscious of another will, which forces itself on me. So some ideas I can sort of call to mind at will, and others I can just sort of leave by the wayside. I can come up with as many different ideas as I want. I can control the contents of my consciousness, but then some things they just sort of force themselves on me. And those ideas, the ones that force themselves on me, are coming from another will, right? So try as hard as I might, I can't get rid of these sensations of a torn rotator cuff, right? So you have a toothache, a pain, an ache, something that you wouldn't cook up yourself. Yeah, but it's something that forces itself on you, an experience that you're having that you don't want to have. Well, Locke would say that's the material world, which does what it does, whether you want it to or not. And Berkeley says, well, that's just God giving you experiences you perhaps prefer not to have. Okay. And I see on the second slide here, again, I'm contrasting the concept of idealism, which states only the mental exists, both minds and ideas. It's a metaphysical theory about what exists. It says objects are permanent possibilities of sensations or collections of qualities or ideas. And then Berkeley has this phenomenalism view, which is a view about what words mean in ordinary language. And he uses the phenomenalism to push the idealism, but we can separate out the two and perhaps see the phenomenalism as something kind of deep and interesting, and the idealism is something which is maybe difficult to refute, but we probably think is mistaken. Okay. So, if you look in the text, there's this argument about who the real skeptic is. So, let's see, it's on page, I want to start on page 91. This is Hylas, again standing for Locke. And he says, you were represented in last night's conversation as one who maintained the most extravagant opinion that ever entered to the mind of man, to wit, that there is no such thing as material substance in the world. And then Philonous says that there is no such thing as what the philosophers call material substance. I am seriously persuaded. But if I were made to see anything absurd or skeptical in this, then I should have the same reason to renounce this that I imagine I have now to reject the contrary opinion. So he's just basically saying, I'm keeping an open mind. And then Hylas is just amazed that, yes, it turns out that what he heard secondhand about his friend is true. And so Hylas says, what? Well, that should be a what explanation point. Looks like there's a typo in the text there. What explanation point? Can anything be more fantastical, more repugnant to common sense, a more manifest piece of skepticism than to believe there is no such thing as matter? And, Philonous says, calm down. Softly, good Hylas. What if it should prove that you, who hold there is, by virtue of the opinion, a greater skeptic, and maintain more paradoxes and repugnances to common sense than I, who believe no such thing? So in other words, this is Berkeley sort of putting out a strategy. I'm going to show you that you recoil at the idea there's no such thing as material substance. I'm going to show you that it actually creates more problems than it solves. That there are actually more paradoxes, more problems with this concept of matter that you're trying to pitch as common sense than there are than to deny the concept of matter. Okay, they go on. Philonous says, pray Hylas, what do you mean by skeptic? So you see this in the really good philosophers. They're always careful about definitions and meanings. And, Hylas says, one that doubts everything. And so a person that, Philonous says, excuse me, Philonous says, okay, so a person that just denies one particular point can't be a skeptic. And then Philonous says, he that denies any point can more be said to doubt of it than he affirms of the same degree of assurance. Let's see, come down here. How do you pronounce me a skeptic because I deny what you affirm? So in other words, if you're a skeptic, you deny everything, and Philonous says, I'm not denying everything. And then he says, well, okay, so if you just deny one point, then that doesn't count. But then who's the denier? I just sort of might come up with the global warming thing, right? So like, these people talk about these global warming deniers, but who's the denier? The person that denies climate change exists, or the person that denies climate change doesn't exist? Or in other words, the person who supports climate change. And here, this question of who's the skeptic, the person who's skeptical about the concept of matter, or the person who's skeptical about that there can be minds and ideas without an external world of matter. So the question is, who's the greater skeptic? And then and Hylas keeps on wanting to say, look, if you deny the existence of matter, you are a skeptic. And this is an interesting point about Berkeley. He does not want to wear the skeptic mantle. In fact, he sees himself as arguing against skeptics and atheists. He sees himself as the friend of common sense. He's the guy that says, I am an empiricist. Empiricism is the philosophy of common sense. What does empiricism tell you? Empiricism tells you that what's real is what you can see, taste, touch, smell, and hear. That's what's real. This whole idea of an external world of matter that stands in between you and God, it's an abstraction by philosophers. It's not common sense. It's a rationalist idea, if you like, and it's not based on the senses. So they get so they've finally settled down on this, who's the real skeptic, and essentially Philonous says, well, let's investigate it. So he says, shall we therefore examine which of us it is that denies the reality of sensible things and professes the greatest ignorance of them? So a skeptic is being seen as a person who denies the existence of sensible things. So now Philonous says, well, what mean you by sensible things? And then Hylas says, well, those things that are perceived by the senses. What else could it mean? And then again, Philonous being somewhat disingenuous, but and he's going to lead Hylas down the primrose path here. He says, pardon me, Hylas, but I am desirous to clearly apprehend your notions. And I'm trying to understand you here. Are those things perceived by the senses which are perceived immediately, that is, directly? Or may those things properly be said to be sensible which are perceived mediately, that is, through some medium, or not without the intervention of others? So Hylas doesn't get it, and so Philonous says, okay, here's an example. In reading a book, what I immediately perceive are the letters, right? So when you're reading a book, like I'm reading this text here, what am I immediately or directly perceiving? Again, immediate means not mediated by anything else. So what do I directly perceive? Well, the letters. But mediately, or by means of these, are suggested to the mind the notions of God, virtue, truth, etc. Like he's reading a book of philosophy. Now that the letters are truly sensible things are perceived by the senses, there's no doubt, right? So you see the letters directly. But I would know whether you take the things suggested to be them to be so too. So in other words, what are sensible things? Well, letters on a page of a book. But if the book is telling you, say, about God, does that make God a sensible thing? Right? If the book's talking about the notion of truth or virtue, does that mean truth or virtue are sensible things? Right? Can you sense truth or virtue? That those don't seem to be the sorts of things. So Hylas says no. I don't think it's ridiculous. It's absurd to think God or virtue are sensible things. So this is the first nail in Philonous' coffin. So he makes this important distinction between what's immediately or directly perceived and what's indirectly perceived. So let's see. So finally, Philonous says, here's what we agree on then, that sensible things are those which are immediately or directly perceived by the senses. So he says, so now he says, tell me whether when we perceive anything by sight except for light and colors and figures, or by hearing, do we sense anything other than sounds? And by the palate, do we have anything except tastes? Smell, do we have anything but odors? Touch, anything more than tangible qualities, right? Eye says, nope. Okay, so that's all we perceive through the senses. And then he brings up heat and says, okay, that too. So, and move down here a little bit. And there's a question about heat and pain, right? So, so Philonous says, how can a great heat exist since you own it cannot be in a material substance? Right, so they're talking about feeling heat and then it having occasion pain. So Philonous says, upon putting your hand near the fire, do you perceive one simple uniform sensation or two? And then Hylas says, well, just one. And is the heat, directly perceived? It is. Now, what about the pain? Or you get your hand too close to the fire. And then Philonous says, they're both, he makes this point, they're both immediately perceived. They're both directly. So then finally the conclusion that Hylas is forced to accept is a very violent and painful heat cannot exist without the mind. Right, so heat's a sensible thing. Heat can cause pain, but the pain doesn't exist without the mind. Let's see. I'm going to skip down to something else here.
May I have your attention, please? All passengers on JetBlue, flight 1521, with service to Long Beach, please proceed immediately to gate C6.
All right, that's not my plane. I might come back to this. There's lots of examples about pain. And they talk about taste, so they keep on going through the senses. And so Hylas sees where this is going, and he says, hold, Philonous, I see now what it deluded me. You asked whether heat or cold and sweetness were particular sorts of pain and pleasure. And I said that they were. I should have distinguished those qualities as perceived by us, our pleasures, and and they're paired with these external objects. So he's trying to make this distinction between primary and secondary quality, right? So the primary and secondary qualities. So he wants to say that there's no heat in the fire. Heat is the sensation we feel. And there's no sweetness in the sugar, right? Because the sweetness is a sensation we feel. Because those things are perceived by us, and they're not in the object themselves. And Philonous tries to get them back on the point here. So, and again, his point he's hammering home is the things we immediately perceive by the senses are these sensible qualities. So all we actually perceive are ideas. It's all mental. And Hylas wants to say, well, there's the physical story, there's what's going on in the external world of matter, and then there's the sensations we have. So on page, bottom of page 100, let's see, come up a little bit here. So, Hylas is trying to talk about the tree in the forest thing, right? If a tree falls in the forest, does it make a sound? So, Philonous says, then as to sounds, are they inherent in external bodies or not? So, do sounds exist out there in the external world of matter that's supposedly exists, or do they exist in our minds? And of course, Philonous wants to say they only exist in our minds. And Hylas says that they inhere not in sonars' bodies as plain, for hence, because a bell is struck in the exhausted receiver, an air pump sends no sound. So he's talking about if you pump the air out of a chamber and hit a bell, it's not going to make any sound. So it's like, that you need a medium of air. So, these guys are smart. They're fairly sophisticated. So this is an experiment that was done at the time. You pump the air out of a chamber, you create a vacuum, and you hit a bell, and there's no air for molecules to be disturbed, and so it doesn't make a sound, right? And in space, no one can hear you scream. This is the tagline for the first Alien movie. The air, therefore, must be thought the subject of sound. Because when any motion is raised in the air, says Hylas, we perceive a greater or lesser according to the air's motion. And without some motion in the air, we never hear any sound at all. So, and Hylas explains basically how sound sound perception works. It's the motion of the external air that produces in the mind the sensation of sound. For striking on the drum of the ear, it causeth a vibration, which by auditory nerves being communicated to the brain, the soul thereupon is affected with the sensation called sound. A very modern sounding explanation of how we hear. Might have been out of a biology textbook. And then, but then Philonous says, Hylas says, so it's sound is a sensation we get in the mind from the disturbance of air molecules. And then Philonous says, can any sensation exist without the mind? And Hylas says, well, no. And then Philonous asks this question: how then can sound, being a sensation, exist in the air, if by air you mean a senseless substance existing without the mind? Right, so there's this weird kind of ambiguity in our language. You have this idea of a sound as that which is heard, but there's also this idea of sound as the disturbance of air molecules. And once Hylas admits that sound is that which is heard, this whole air molecule stuff doesn't make any sense, and he ends up contradicting himself. And then he tries to go back, and Hylas says, well, you have to distinguish between sound in terms of disturbance of air molecules versus the sound we hear. So one is just a vibration, and the other thing is the sensation produced by the vibration. And then Philonous says, well, wait, a minute ago you were saying the sound is nothing more than a vibration in the air molecule. And then so you get this weird idea that, let's see, Philonous says, is it good sense to speak of motion as a thing that's loud, sweet, acute, or grave? So in other words, if sound is just a vibration, how can you describe it as being loud? It's sort of this weird idea that, and then later on he makes him say, which of your senses do you experience sound with? And he says, okay, so you say sound is a kind of motion in the air molecule, right? So you motion. So are you saying motion belongs to hearing? No, it's like sight and touch, right? So here's the coup de grace on the coup de grace on page 102. It should follow then, according to you, real sounds may possibly be seen or felt, but never heard. So Philonous has made Hylas say that because sound is this disturbance in the air molecules, it's a kind of motion, it's a vibration. So you could see a vibration, you can feel a vibration, but you can never hear it, right? So, and then Hylas, says, look, you Philonous, you may, if you please, jest at my opinion, but that won't alter the truth of things. So he gets a little bit perturbed and says, look, you're trying to make a mockery of me, and it's not going to work, and tries to argue some more, and says, and then Philonous doubles down on it. He says, can you think of a more philosophical paradox than to say real sounds are never heard, and that the idea of them is attained by some other sense, and that there's nothing, and then Hylas says that basically, to deal disingenuously, I do not like it. So he doesn't like the way this is going. So then they come back to colors. And they get back to this thing about what's immediately perceived. And they're talking about these clouds. And so these clouds are sort of red and purple. And then talking about whether they're really red or purple or just appear that way. And of course, Berkeley's done some work on optics. Let's see. So now the next absurdity, page 106. How then do you affirm that colors are in the light, since by light you understand a corporeal substance external to the mind? Again, so he's like, well, the clouds aren't really purple, but there's sort of this trick of light sort of refracting for the mist, and it creates these sensations in us, but the light is sort of this thing going on in the external world. And then Hylas says, well, light and colors are immediately or directly perceived by us. I grant cannot exist without the mind. But in themselves, they are only motions and configurations of certain insensible particles of matter, right? So again, the split between the that which is seen colors, shapes, right? But then there's a physical picture of the light that's bouncing off, or something like photons, right? He's talking about these basically light particles. Let's see. So again, Philonous says, so what you're saying is red and blue, which we see are not real colors, but certain unknown motions and figures which no man ever did see are truly so. Are these not shocking? And are they not simply so many ridiculous inferences as those you were obliged to renounce in the case of sounds? So a minute ago, Hylas is pigeonholed into saying that sounds can never be heard, only felt or seen. And now here he's saying red and blue, colors can never be seen, that they're part of this world of insensible matter. And then Hylas comes back to the secondary qualities, right? So remember, and he gives again, this is Locke, right? Straight out of a Locke, page 106. And he says, well, look, there's primary and secondary qualities. The primary qualities are things like extension, like having size and shape. Or extension is just having size of some kind. Figure, that's the shape. Solidity, gravity, motion, and rest. These exist in real bodies, material objects. And then there are these other qualities that are caused by these real qualities. And then Philonous says, you're saying extension and figures are inherent in these external unthinking substances, like these are part of the material world. And then these secondary qualities are different. These are things that exist in us. Let's see. Going here. They get to the example of the tulip, so it'll make some sense. Let's see. Well, on Philonous actually tries to help him out here. So they're talking about these supposed qualities of matter, and Philonous says, let me help you out here. So consider extension. Again, that's its idea of having size. Can extension exist without the mind? Or these are things like motion and solidity and gravity. And more of the primary, secondary qualities. And then Hylas says, well, look, okay, here's what's going on. There's this difference between absolute extension and sensible extension. So there's sort of the extension that's out there in the external world, and there's the extension that I observe. Let's see. Let's skip over this bit here. Here's the tulip. It's on the bottom of page 112. That's what I was looking for here. So then Hylas says, The sensation I take to be an act of the mind perceiving, besides which there is something perceived. This I call the object. For example, there is red and yellow on that tulip, but the act of perceiving those colors is in me only and not in the tulip. Right? So this is the standard line on secondary qualities. It's the color of the tulip is not in the tulip itself, it's in me. It's the color is the tulip affecting me through its primary qualities, which it really has. And then Philonous says, what tulip do you speak of? Is it that which you see? The same. And what do you see besides color, figure, extension? So like, what do you see besides the shape, the size, and the color of the tulip? Nothing. So then, what's there? And this is the whole thing about extension. Isn't this extension something you're perceiving with sight? And then Philonous says that the colors are really in the tulip, which I see as manifest. Right? So you can see that where is, when you're looking at the... Sorry about these interruptions. I'm going to try to talk over the lady. It seems like they cranked up the speaker.
Chelsea Cummings, please proceed to a white-paging telephone and press 0 for an important message. Chelsea Cummings, please proceed to a white-paging telephone and press 0 for an important message.
Okay, so they're talking about the tulip, and the idea is that the tulip might exist, in my mind, but not your mind, or your mind, not my mind. But the idea of it existing as an unthinking substance exterior to all minds is a contradiction. So how can you have, he's talking about, this is the tulip that we saw. So you can't say it's an unthinking substance if it's the tulip which has been perceived. And then Hylas says, you have an artful way, Philonous, of diverting our inquiry from the subject. And so Philonous says, well, we were talking about the difference between the sensation and object. And again, Hylas wants to say, in every case, there's the object out there in the external world, and there's a sensation created in me. And it's Philonous' job to try to drive him into contradiction by showing that you can't make this separation. That all there are the perceptions. There's just the ideas in his mind, and that's it. Let's see. And then he kind of leads him down the primrose path, and finally they're back to this sort of definition of matter. So this is the argument I talked about one thing supports another thing by being extended under it. So qualities, substance is that which supports qualities. And so that means it has to be spread underneath it, and it has to have another substance underneath it, and another one underneath it, and they go on forever. And so he gets to this argument, and then Hylas says, you take things in a strict literal sense. That is not fair, Philonous. And then Philonous says, well, tell me, you say matter supports or stands under accidents. How does it? Is it like your legs support your body? And, Hylas says, no, it's not a literal sense. And then Philonous says, well, just tell me in what sense. And, Hylas says, I declare I know not what to say. I once thought I understood well enough what was meant by matters supporting accidents, and that's just qualities. So, and when you see the word accident, it's just talking about a quality or a way in which an object exists. It's a kind of old medieval term. So he says, but now the more I think of it, the less I can comprehend it. right? So he thinks he has this clear idea of matter sort of supporting these qualities. There being objects which have these ways in which they exist. You have, a ball which exists in a red way and a round way. You have the object, the ball, and it has these qualities, being red and round and maybe bouncy or what have you, right? It, having a certain size and shape. And this is this common sense notion. But then you start thinking, what's the relationship between an object and its qualities? And in what sense do you mean that matter supports qualities or sort of holds them together? Hylas is at a loss to explain. The literal sense doesn't work out, so now he's thinking of some metaphorical sense, but he can't really qualify what he means. And then finally at the end, Hylas says, I was wrong, Ion, but still I fear there's some fallacy other. Pray what you think of this. And then he comes up with a new way to try to do things. And then Philonous tells him his solution. He has this new, I think he's come up with a new idea, and he's like, don't you remember, we dealt with that all before, it didn't work either. So the basic strategy that he has here is to try to show contradictions in Hylas's, which is Locke's view, that anytime you start out with some basic premise of Locke's philosophy, it ends up in some absurdity or other. And the absurdities always end up with this distinction between the two senses of sensible thing. Whether you're talking about the external world picture and the material object, which is the cause of the sensation, or whether you're talking about the sensation itself in the mind. And let's see.
May I have any available country agents to 86?
Joy Caesar.
Any available country agents to 86? Thank you.
So I give you a lot of this to see the back and forth. And originally it looks like, well, how is Berkeley going to pull this off? How is he going to argue there's no such thing as matter? But then you look at the particular arguments he makes, and it's Hylas that ends up looking like the fool. And so as you go through these, try to figure out, like, where's the problem here? And what is this strange thing between matter and consciousness? How is it that material objects cause conscious states? And isn't there this ambiguity between the concept of a sound as that which is heard, and a sound as a vibration or disturbance of air molecules, of sight as a visual sensation versus sight as photons floating through the air, or wavelengths of light reflecting into the eye and going to, causing the optic nerve to emit impulses. Okay. And again, Berkeley wants to say this. I'm the philosopher of common sense. I say that what you see is what you get. You have sensations, and that's all there are. The sensations, they come directly to you from God. This whole idea of a middleman, an external world of matter, which itself cannot be sensed, but which we must posit to explain our sensations. There's no reason to suppose it exists. Looking at these questions on 130, does Berkeley accept Locke's distinction between primary and secondary qualities? Absolutely not, right? Because it's the distinction between a quality is an object that an object really has, as opposed to one that's partly created by us. And of course, in Berkeley's view, they're all in us. Difference between perception and imagination. And basically, it's a question about how much control we have over it. So when you perceive something, that could be sensation, or when you perceive something, that sensation's coming from God. The imagination is up to you. You have an internal locus of control. Perception is what God sort of forces on you to experience, whether you want to or not. So it's a matter of whether you have control over it, but it's not the difference between something that's real and something that's fake. Both imagination and perception are real. They're both just ideas. It's just that one's under your control and one's not. One's coming from God and one's coming from you. And again, this argument from God's existence, like, where do these ideas that I have come from, the ones that I don't want? Why am I having ideas that I don't want? Well, don't seem to be creating them. God's creating them, is this idea. God's sending you the ideas you don't want. God's sending you the idea of a toothache. And some people have suggested, well, doesn't that make God into a monster? Doesn't that make him evil? If he's giving you these torturous sensations of a torn rotator cuff, or a toothache, or yet another announcement coming over the loudspeakers that Chelsea Cummings has left something and needs to come to the customer service station, right? All these experiences you have that you don't want, and some of them are pretty horrific. So this idea that God sort of sends you these experiences that aren't real. But then if you think about the problem of evil, it doesn't really solve it to say, well, God created the material universe and it's kind of this middleman, because whether God gives you the toothache directly or whether he creates a world where your teeth decay and fall apart, it seems like it's still God's responsibility, right? It's the shoddy workmanship. The buck stops here. So whether pain and suffering come via the material world or whether God sends them directly to you, it seems that God's still responsible. Samuel Johnson once said, "I refute him thus," and kicked a rock to try to refute Berkeley. Well, why is this a bad refutation of Berkeley? It would be the question I'd like you to discuss if you didn't discuss it last time. And maybe also discuss whether, again, empiricism is a friend of science. Berkeley's an empiricist, but his view seems like it questions basic scientific premises about the material world, right? The material world, materialism is sort of a methodological assumption of modern science, and yet it seems that Berkeley is attacking this idea. He's attacking the entire notion of material substance. So then the question is, how can you do that? And maybe is there something wrong with, not with materialism, maybe there's something wrong with empiricism, right? So we'll come to Hume and see that Hume is sort of like Berkeley without God. And so next week we'll be talking about how empiricism can lead to an even greater skepticism. So imagine, Berkeley, and Berkeley at least he's got minds and ideas. He's got a kind of a form of cause and effect. He calls it willing. So you have an intention, and then God sends you a sensation based on that intention. So you have agency in the world, but it's sort of an indirect way. So like I want to hold my phone up at a certain angle, and then God sends me the resulting sensations or associated sensations that he wants me to have. Sometimes my intentions, are successful, sometimes not. So the basic idea, though, is that I have these I have these intentions, and then God sends me experiences, as opposed to this idea that we go through the material world. So it's a kind of cause and effect. It's called willing. So Hume gets rid of cause and effect entirely. He gets rid of God, and he even gets rid of the mind. So according to Hume, there are no minds, there's no cause and effect, there's no material world. All there is ideas and the association of ideas. And that's, so you end up with this sort of extreme skepticism about everything. So Hume really is a skeptic, and he wears the the badge of skeptic proudly, whereas Berkeley kind of shies away from it. He says, "Well, I'm not a skeptic. I'm Mr. Common Sense." But he really, Berkeley is pretty skeptical about things that most people take for granted. But Hume says, I am the skeptic, and I think Berkeley's right about a lot of things. And furthermore, here's a bunch of other things which, I'm going to get rid that I think you should be skeptical about too. And so I'm going to use Berkeley's arguments to tear down the sort of Lockean view, which is kind of common sense. And I'm going to pile on top. I'm going to add even more. I'm going to add even more paradoxes and say, well, you really can't believe in the mind, you can't believe in cause and effect, and you can't believe in matter, and you can't believe in God. So what are you left with just the ideas and the association of ideas. All right, I think that's about all we have time for today. So I hope you have a good discussion. Again, feel free to send me a little message. And I'm available for office hours, posting the announcements, and next week we'll talk about, and don't forget to post the forums, still do Sunday night, 11:55 p.m., and topics are up, and I guess that's it, and then next week we will start on David Hume. The last empiricist we'll look at, and then move on to Kant, who forges a sort of middle path between rationalism and empiricism. And hopefully I'll be there with some more interesting scenery for you to look at. And interesting philosophical ideas, of course.